for those on the other side, is it any wonder that we're seeing a growing number of calls for civility in politics? But what exactly do we mean by civility? Is this behavior really new? Do these calls for civility privilege some people over others? Where do we go from here? These are the things we're going to explore with our panelists today. Joining us for this discussion are 4 seasoned professionals with extensive background in communication and politics. All have served as members of the White House or campaign staff and have experience with political debates or engagement with the media. On a more personal note, each of these individuals also played a significant role in the creation, growth, and development of the Bully Pulpit Series. And on behalf of the faculty in the Department of Communication and students and the Department of Political Science, I just want to thank you for your efforts. Your work has truly had an impact on the College of Charleston, on our students, and on our community at large. I want to thank you for your support, and I especially want to thank you for your participation here today. I'll start our discussion with a brief introduction to each panelist in alphabetical order. Our first panelist is Jeannie Bunton. Ms. Bunton served as a White House aide to George H.W. Bush in the Office of Media Affairs and the Office of Presidential Speechwriting. In addition, she served as senior counselor at Policy Impact and director of press and public affairs for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. Our second panelist is Tucker Eskew. Mr. Eskew began his career on President Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign, held leadership roles in both Bush-Cheney campaigns, and was counselor to the GOP vice presidential nominee in 2008. He served as deputy assistant to the president from 2001 to 2003, and after 9/11, Mr. Eskew served in London as the president's wartime communications representative to number 10 Downing Street. Our third panelist is Mr. Mike McCurry. Mr. McCurry served as White House press secretary to President Bill Clinton, director of communications for the Democratic National Committee, and held many leadership roles in the Democratic National campaigns from 1984 to 2004. He is also the former co-chairman of the Commission on Presidential Debates, which sponsors the general election debates between candidates for president and vice president. And our final panelist is Greg Schneiders, former White House Director of Communications under President Jimmy Carter, as well as the Democratic leadership for the US Senate. He also led the communication efforts for several presidential campaigns. So as you can see, we have quite an accomplished group of people with a tremendous background and experience to share with us today. I'd like to give each of them about 3 minutes to introduce themselves to you, share a bit more about their specific experience. And panelists, I'll ask that you offer some initial thoughts on the climate of civility in politics today as a part of your introduction. And we'll start with Jeannie.
Thank you, Beth. It's a joy to be among all of you. Hello out there. I'm so proud of the College of Charleston and everything that you've undertaken there to chart a path for your professional development and the way you'll shape the world. It's fun to be with the guys on the panel today. By way of introduction, I believe my introduction to politics began when I was probably 10 years old, standing in the old gymnasium of H.E. McCracken school, watching my mother be an election proctor, recording and tabulating votes for the election of that time. I don't recall the year, but I recall the impression it left me, the importance of it. And I was so proud of my mother for playing this very, very important outsized role in a very small town of 350 people. From that experience, I drew on it and have always been attracted to public service. And politics is a pathway to serving the public. Early on, I was the editor of my hometown newspaper, which allowed me to be introduced to then Congressman Arthur Ravenel of the 1st Congressional District of Charleston at the time. That introduction led me to work with a very rock star press secretary named Tucker Eskew, who was the spokesman for the governor of South Carolina. And I was reporting on a very thorny issue that ultimately led me to work for Congressman Ravenel in Washington. Once I was in Washington, I undertook graduate school and met a very sharp person who was working for George Herbert Walker Bush in his media affairs office. She lectured our class and I was smitten. I always knew that I'd be the first female press secretary in the White House, but Dee Dee Myers beat me to the punch. From there, the White House, I guess you could say, I used my clips and my experience honed in my hometown newspaper to then ultimately be brought on in the Office of Media Affairs as an intern made myself indispensable, and then Tony Snow hired me to work in the Office of Presidential Speech Writing. So fast forward, I now am the chief of staff at a trade association in Washington that represents banks. So I've been on both sides of the policy issues, explaining it and reporting on it. And I think that's pretty much the perch from which I see things playing out. As for the climate, I would say thunder, not yet rain, with regard to civility. And hey, if a jug of cranberry juice and TikTok can put Fleetwood Mac back on the billboard, I think we can make some progress in our civil tone.
Thank you, Jeannie. Mike, I think, or Tucker, I think is next.
Okay, I'll take it, but hand it off to Mike. Thank you, Beth. Thank you to all of you and Jeannie. So great to be back with my friends. I made a lot of friends at the College of Charleston. I'm a South Carolinian, as Jeannie touched on. Grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, son of a journalist, and loved the exchange of news and information, and then got hooked on politics. Was able to go to the University of the South and come out of there and go straight to Washington, thanks to an internship in the Senate and then an internship at the White House for another South Carolinian, a guy named Lee Atwater, and converted that pretty quickly into a presidential campaign experience in 1984, where I was in charge of what later became known in Democratic campaigns as the War Room. We clipped newspapers. We didn't have cut and paste functions on computers because we didn't have computers. I know it sounds old, but it was the latest. We had 4 televisions and 4 VCRs in the War Room. It was incredible. Look, I got to work for a man who believed that the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and ally, not a 20% traitor. And it shaped my view of politics, as did my next big campaign, helping an upstart South Carolina congressman run for governor in the Palmetto State. Against all odds, we won. We really didn't think we had much of a chance in 1986, and I spent 8 years in his office battling. Now, civility was much more the order of the day back then, absolutely, but we fought. We were assertive. We were led by a governor who was an aggressive politician, but he subscribed to that theory of Ronald Reagan's. And it is, as Jeannie says, not so far out of reach, and yet it keeps slipping slightly farther away. I felt after getting out of politics and starting an e-commerce business that I had one more campaign left in me, and went off to Texas, closed a business, sold a house, moved a 7.5-month pregnant wife to Austin, Texas, for a man who said he was a uniter, not a divider. And George W. Bush lives to that code. And yet events that transpired during the first term of that Bush White House and the second term after I'd left strained those bonds of civility. So yes, it is still outside our grasp. And I'll wrap up by saying my efforts in this regard today are devoted toward news literacy, toward electing members of Congress who agree to a code of civility and cross-partisanship. And maybe later I'll explain what I see as the difference between cross-partisanship and the more mushy bipartisanship. You know, I'd love to talk about all of those things, but it's time to turn it over to the man who came up with the name of the Bully Pulpit and used that Bully Pulpit, Mike McCurry.
Well, how can you do better in an introduction like that? Thank you, Tucker. There's a lot of stuff in my background that I could describe, but the most important thing is I was born at Roper Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. So I've got South Carolina roots. My family has always been up country up near Abbeville, South Carolina, if anybody knows that territory, and that's where my mom lives to this day, and we are going down to visit her on Sunday. So I get to get down to South Carolina a fair bit. I would say that state is got a more complicated history and a more complicated set of politics than I think a lot of people understand, because I think it is a place where we see all the transformational things happening in our politics, with the influx of new voters, people from different backgrounds, people with different ethnic identities. And it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. I still have a hard time believing that South Carolina will become a blue state. And even though I think Jamie Harrison is a great guy, I mean, I have questions about how that will come out at the end of the day. But a little on my background, I went to Princeton University, graduated in 1976, thought I was going to become a newspaper reporter. I had lined up a job, and then the job fell through because the Washington Post sold the newspaper that I was going to go to work for. So I've always sort of said I got screwed by the Washington Post early in my life, and it wasn't the first time. But then I got involved in a campaign and worked for an uncommitted slate that actually ended up winning the New Jersey primary. Went to work as a result of that in Washington, D.C. I got recruited by a guy named Greg Schneiders to go to work for the John Glenn campaign in 1984. And that was my introduction to presidential politics. And so one way or another, I've been involved in all those campaigns since. I was the co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates, did 3 cycles, and thankfully then retired before the current debate cycle began. So I'm not involved in the discussions there, but following them very, very closely. And, my main takeaway is that there's multiple ways in which people can get engaged and be involved, and we've got to stay at this, and we've got to encourage students and others who are in a place to really make a difference to go out and be involved one way or another. I mean, I think that's the story that I learned. That's certainly was my experience growing up and coming into politics. But I'm enjoying life now as a retired Politico, and I now teach at the Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington, D.C. So I'm teaching in the area of faith and politics. So if anybody has got a question about that, I think there are enormous ways in which our political environment has been impacted by the involvement of the faith community, both right and left. And I think that's an area that I work in, and that might produce some interesting questions. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Schneiders.
Thank you. So you all just got a glimpse of why. See if I am unmuted here.
You're good.
Good.
You're good.
Okay. Well, you got a glimpse of civility in action there with Mike's comments, because he mentioned that he worked for an uncommitted slate in New Jersey in the '76 campaign. He didn't mention that slate was actually committed to Jerry Brown, and they beat Jimmy Carter in New Jersey. And that's the first time I've heard Mike tell that story and not point that out. So I appreciate the progress towards civility. My background is I did not start out in politics or communications or polling. I started out in the bar business. I was a senior at Georgetown University. I got an opportunity to borrow some money and buy the bar that I had been working in, and then buy another one. So for the first 6 years that I was out of college, that's what I was doing, which is about all I could do with a degree in philosophy. So I learned everything I know about civility tending bar, which has put me in good stead doing politics. And then went on to, of course, work with Jimmy Carter and President Carter when he won the White House. And after that, as Mike mentioned, we worked together for Senator John Glenn. I worked for Bob Byrd when he was the Democratic leader in the Senate. And then again, Mike and I worked with Bruce Babbitt. And I would say I'm very proud of the fact that, Carter Glenn, Babbitt, and to a slightly lesser extent, Robert Byrd, were all extremely civil political leaders. I mean, they had their partisan views, they had their strong ideological views on some things, but they did not insult people. They did not question people's motives. They worked when they could in a bipartisan way. It struck me as we were preparing for this that all of you who are at the College of Charleston now, I'm assuming you are somewhere between the ages of 18 and 22, 23, thereabouts. I'm also assuming you probably were not following politics very closely before the age of 10. So that means that if you've been following politics for 8 years, you have lived through and watched the 4 years of Barack Obama and the 4 years of Donald Trump. Suffice it to say, they're very different eras and periods. I'm tempted as a Democrat to characterize it as from the sublime to the ridiculous, but that would be uncivil, so I shouldn't go there. To put this in a little bit of context, I do believe that we are living in an unusually divisive, partisan, uncivil time right now, and there are a lot of reasons for that that we can go into later. But I would put it in some context and remind you that way back in the founding of this country, and if you've all seen Hamilton, the play or the movie, or listened to the score, you know how that turned out. The Vice President of the United States shot and killed the former Treasury Secretary over a dispute. A little bit after that, as we were in the Civil War era, and there's a South Carolina aspect to this. Your Congressman Preston Brooks beat Charles Sumner senseless and into a coma. We continued to beat him until his cane broke on the floor of the Senate. So, we like to look back in a gauzy way at how civil things used to be, but as far as I know, recently nobody's been shot and killed by a political opponent in the course of a dispute over politics, and nobody's been beaten nearly to death on the floor of the Senate. So it could be worse. Maybe we're headed there. But I look forward to the discussion of civility and to your questions.
Great, thank you guys. I just wanted to start with a question. We've been talking about sort of and thank you, Greg, for providing that context. I think it's helpful to sort of set the frame that it's not like we're trying to go back to something we've always had in some ways. I think it's also important to note, though, that when we talk about civility, that there are those who argue that civility is a term of privilege, that it reinforces the status quo, that it preserves hierarchy, doesn't allow for marginalized voices. For example, Keith Bybee argues that if you're in the majority, you can, quote, deploy the idea of civility to shut down dissenting voices, end quote. And others argue that civility is linked to a particular normative conception of democratic politics, and that we should resist those conceptions, that most of our real change has happened when we've ignored those conventions, the suffrage movement, civil rights, AIDS activism in the 80s. These were all seen as going against the norms of civility of the time. How do you respond to that line of thinking when it comes to civility? How do we navigate civility in a way that it becomes an inclusive instrument of change as opposed to a means of silencing oppressed groups?
Well, I would say that if you substitute the word violence for civility, you could probably make a similar argument. And there are people who make that argument that nonviolent protest, is not going to get you and your cause where you need to get. You're not going to get the attention. But Martin Luther King, I think, demonstrated that you could be nonviolent and be effective. And I would say you can also be civil and be effective. You take a strong position, you make clear what that position is, you argue it every opportunity you have, but you stop short of insults and denigrating your opponent or anybody who disagrees with you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we've learned this, that as a country, we do have to get outside our comfort zones. So I think a little bit of the quotation you gave, Beth, is, and I'd like to be civil about this, a straw man argument. I think there are people who would use civility as a means to shut down disagreement and conflict that can lead to change. So it's not a complete straw man, but for most people, I believe civility is within our reach, while accepting change, embracing change, encouraging it. And we do, as a country, have to get more comfortable, and conservatives have to get more comfortable at understanding the demographic change, the technological change, the societal change all around us. It is the only way that the party that I used to call my home, and now I'm sort of homeless, is going to get with the times and rebuild itself, or it will wither. And demographics are destiny. It will wither. But I would just push back a little bit to say that yes, we need people to get outside their comfort zones, but we can do that civilly. We can do that recognizing the many things that we have in common, and we need leadership to help do that. But there's some grassroots personal responsibility in that too. Maybe we can get to that.
Well, that speaks a little bit to what might be creating such a divisive sense in our discourse, right? So if we want to try and find common ground, sometimes the challenge, I think, in those discussions is being able to see that as opposed to where we're incredibly different. What's driving that change these days?
Well, one thing, and I don't want to monopolize this, but it's the filter bubbles. We all have the ability now, and too many of us the willingness to receive information and news that only affirms our own biases. And therefore we create a kind of alternate reality that confirms our own rightness. And one of my causes right now as a board member at the News Literacy Project is to get originally our mission high school students, now really the entire population of the United States, to begin to understand better the ways to select information, the ways to share it and not share it. And if something makes you really emotional, very quickly, we ask you to pause before sharing it with others and consider the source. So I think that's one aspect of it, Beth.
Any other thoughts from other panelists?
Something that I keep coming back to is tone. And somewhere along the line, we forgot to stop listening to one another. And it seems like there seems to be this escalating need to outsnark the other opponent. And I see that increasingly on social media. Twitter, for instance, comes to mind immediately, where there's a torrent of unleashed emotion rather than reason. And so I'm very excited about Tucker's work with his group to help people just push the brakes before they push the retweet button, if you will.
Yeah, I will chime in too. And Beth, I think there's no good reason. I mean, this may be in academia, something that people are talking about, no good reason to challenge the idea that civility is a better model for the way in which we should have dialogue about politics in our country. I mean, I think anybody making that argument that they're kind of fraught in some kind of academic windup, that doesn't, to me, sound sensible. But anyhow, I don't want to challenge that premise. I'll say that the thing that I think we have to focus on is building better relationships with people that we disagree with. And how do you do that? How do you bring people together who you disagree with? Because we all encamp in our own little world in which we find people that we agree with. I think, as Tucker said, we are subject to confirmation bias. We look at sources of information and content that tend to reaffirm whatever we had before. So how do you get out of that box, and how do you find people and create different kinds of relationships? And that requires real work, because people are not inclined to kind of go find someone from the other and build a real human relationship with them. And how do you do that? How do you make that happen? I've done some work trying to get the US Senate to think about how to do that in their own daily work. I've been trying to get Schumer to propose that every Wednesday morning nobody can have a fundraiser, because that's usually what they do when they're in town. They have breakfast fundraisers in the morning. And I said, Wednesday morning would be a fundraiser free zone. And what you need to do is go take someone from the opposite side of the aisle out for breakfast and get to know them better and build human relationships that will make a difference. Because the problem is these folks don't know each other in the Congress, and in the broader electorate, we don't know people who disagree with us. We know the people who we kind of hang with in our own neighborhoods, but we don't reach out and we don't establish relationships that will make a difference. And I think civility begins with the idea that you actually are civil, you're neighborly, you actually get to know people that you don't necessarily otherwise know anything about. And that's a social transformation, and that's a very, very difficult thing to do. I grant that's not an easy thing to do, but it's actually pretty important to make that happen. And that's, I've been watching a couple of the questions. I do think churches can play a role in that. That's what, my connection into this is the work I do now is to try to get young seminarians to go out in churches and create places where there will be safe conversations to happen. And I think churches are a place where that can happen. Now, many people might say, oh, church and politics, religion and politics, they shouldn't mix. But I do think that there's a role that the faith community can play.
So when we think about building those personal connections and finding an opportunity to really get to know one another so that we can increase civility, one of the things that I think has really been challenging in some of the recent debates and in some of the arguments you see everywhere is, regardless of your ideology, that there are some pretty extreme views that are getting represented, and it's sort of becoming a part of our normal discourse. And I think it's difficult to prepare for a civil debate when there's no shared understanding, because part of building that sense of connection is a sense of a shared understanding of what science is, or what facts are, what truth is. And that all now seems a little bit up for debate. And so how do you prepare a candidate or yourself, asking for a friend, for a debate with someone who might see differently than you or think differently than you, when you can't even agree on that sort of shared sense of truth or fact, for example?
Well, let me take a crack at that. I think a technique that works, and I have actually employed it myself, when you're talking with someone that you know is probably definitely on the other side of every equation that you would care about, is tell me what you really think, and go through what your position is, and then repeat it to them. So you say, okay, so here's what I hear you saying. I hear you saying this XYZ, so that the person knows that they've been heard, and that they know that you're listening, and that they know that you may disagree, but at least you're giving them the respect of actually hearing what they have to say. And then that starts a different kind of conversation, because then what happens, and this has happened to me personally, is the person then kind of turns it around and says, well, why do you think what you think? And then you begin a genuine civil dialogue. And that, I think that's what we're aiming for here, is it's a way of transforming conversations so that they're not like what we see on cable television all day long. It's really conversations in which people are really engaging with each other, even though they may disagree. That is it's, believe me, a very, very hard thing to do. But we have to do that. And I think pedagogically, Beth, I think we have to teach that in the academic institutions. We have got, we're trying to do more of that at the seminary where I teach now, to really, how do you, guide these kinds of authentic conversations? And I think, ultimately that was the whole purpose, the whole bully pulpit idea in the first place. So, it might be something that you guys could consider down there.
We'll be happy to know that it is a part of our introductory class to talk about active listening and techniques for active listening. What I hear you saying is, so it's definitely an education we're familiar with.
And I loved my colleague, Mr. McCurry, mentioning authenticity. That word is timely and needed and urgent in our elected officials and our representatives, and from the PTO to Capitol Hill.
When you talk, Beth, about preparing a candidate for a debate in this age of incivility, I think a positive sign that we've seen very recently, and you don't laugh when I say this, but was the first debate that Trump and Biden had, because there seemed to be a near consensus coming out of that the incivility on one side was so great that it was harmful, politically harmful. Biden got a bump out of it, significant polling bump out of it. And I think, most people attributed that to the fact that people were turned off by the constant interruptions coming mostly from President Trump. I mean, Biden was not 100% civil either. He called him a clown and told him to shut up. But I think, people have been commenting about the debate commission's mute button, which will, they hope, keep one candidate quiet for 2 minutes while the other one is allowed to speak. And the most common reaction coming from both sides now has been that will probably help Trump. It will prevent him from the interruptions that hurt him in the first debate. So in that sense, there does seem to be an appetite for some greater degree of civility and a beginning to turn away from, be turned off by the coarseness of political debate in recent years.
I recall when we were pulled together to help work on preparation for President George Herbert Walker Bush, who was going to debate Mr. Ross Perot and the former governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And we were tasked to come up with zingers and one-liners and sound bites. And it was so not who President George Herbert Walker Bush was and how he conducted himself. And I remember his admonition to everyone during the campaign was that he would not do anything that was beneath the dignity of the office. And this is also, at the time, the White House was structured such that I was one of 6 researchers who was responsible for the factual accuracy of what the president said. So fast forward, here we are, and it's sort of a, I can't find the right word for where we are, but a long way from where we once were. At that particular debate, the height of incivility was when President Bush looked at his wristwatch to see what time it was. And it's gone down to this day to be one of the 8 most recognizable debate disasters because he was so uncouth, he looked at his watch. Mr. McCurry.
I was just going to say, I don't think they filled those jobs at the current White House.
No, they may have filled them with people doing other things. Look, I think about this as a supply and demand issue, and we talked a little bit about the demand side, the pull, the need to have critical thinkers who are able to engage people who have different perspectives. That's very much on the demand side. The supply side is about, to some extent, not exclusively, but our leaders. And I do think there's a strong chance there'll be a change in tone after this election is decided, whenever that is. I'm going to run the risk of double plug and say that a group called With Honor seeks to help on the supply side as well. It's a cross-partisan group that recruits young veterans, veterans of Afghanistan, Iraq wars, to run for Congress from both parties. And they grant support and funding to those who agree to a code of civility, agree to meet once a month, to Mike's point, at least once a month with a member of the opposite party, to sponsor once a year at least one substantive piece of legislation with a member of the opposite party, and to conduct themselves with honor and dignity and civility. So supply and demand.
So I want to move on. We have a lot of great questions in the chat. And so I hate to cut this conversation off because I think I could listen to these stories and listen to your advice for a long time, but I want to make sure we get to some of these questions from students. And one of the first ones is from Isabella to Mike McCurry. How has faith and politics evolved over the last few elections? And why does the divide seem so much greater today?
Well, it's a good subject. You know, for the longest time, the faith community was centrally involved in a lot of major social changes, the civil rights movement, the equal rights movement, the environmental movement. You know, churches were at the forefront of a lot of that. And then I think there was a certain abdication of that leadership role, at least on the progressive faith side, during the 1980s and 90s. And what happened was the conservative moral majority took a lead role and used religion and faith as a way to advance a particular agenda that they had. And that has, you know, that persisted for a while, but I think it's been changing. And I think there's a more ecumenical view now of how people of faith can play a role in politics. And you see, you know, many more progressive groups, you know, organizing and engaging. And the idea is not to sort of, you know, throw religion down the throat of people and say, this is what you need to believe. It's more to sort of say, if you believe in a golden rule, if you believe, now this is a Christian reference, but if you believe you treat thy neighbor as thyself, then what we need in politics is a way in which you don't say things about your opponent that you wouldn't want to have said about yourself. And that would create a whole different tonal quality for our politics if we got away from the way in which we try to demonize the candidate on the other side. And there's no way to enforce that. I mean, I know Tucker and Greg would sort of say it's kind of a hard thing to figure out how you would actually employ, but it could be if you got enough people together to sort of say, we don't do politics like that in America anymore. And we don't run commercials like that anymore, because that's just not who we are as the American people. And we need something that will, you know, bring people together. You can actually articulate sharp differences with an opponent without trying to demonize them or challenge their character or say that they're bad people, or, you know, some of the things that we see going on in politics even today. So there's got to be maybe some way in which we implement some kind of golden rule in politics that will change the way in which we conduct our political conversations.
Let me just pick up on one thing Mike referred to, the difficulty of enforcing that sort of a rule. And that is at the heart of our problem with civility and the lack of it, is that there are no laws to enforce civility. There are no legal penalties. It's all about norms, you know. And every time we've tried to pass laws that even move somewhat in that direction, when we try to pass laws around political reform or pass laws around political contributions, you know, we almost always end up failing and having unintended consequences and sometimes doing more harm than we do good. But what really governs all of this, whether it be political reform or financial reform or civility, are the norms. And we have lived through a period in the last several years where it has been demonstrated that at least some people involved in the political process have not just a disregard for, but an absolute disdain of those norms. And norms are really ultimately enforced by one thing, I think. The principal guardrail around norms is shame. And if you are literally shameless, it doesn't matter if everybody is saying, my God, nobody's ever done that before. That's horrible. That's the worst thing we've ever seen. And you say, yeah, well, so what? If the politician who is shameless, therefore has no interest in norms, he or she can't be charged with a crime or put in prison or run out of office on that basis. And they have no regard for being shamed. And as norms have eroded or just completely fallen, I think the whole issue of civility and a movement back to civility is kind of at an impasse, because what you don't want to do is, and a lot of people pointed this out when Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. Well, a lot of people said, that's a sure loser. You're bringing a knife to a gunfight. And that makes it very difficult to get us out of this terrible situation we find ourselves in.
Greg, my former boss, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, had a term for this, which was called defining deviancy down.
Yeah.
And, that's where we've been, as you just described.
So Will, in his question notes, is this a slippery slope where the divide is bound to get worse, or is true civil discourse in politics something we can recover?
History is not linear. All of us can take responsibility for trying to make change, and it is not inevitable that it get worse. And the genius of the American experiment is that we have within our founding the seeds of change and the protection of the dignity of every individual. And if we adhere to those principles and have leaders who exhibit them, we can change. I have to believe that.
I also think, that it may be a matter of the fever breaking. It may be that we have reached such a point, and particularly, I think this will be true. I'm a Democrat, I'm a Biden supporter. But I think if Joe Biden in 10 days or whatever it is, wins very convincingly in a very big way, and it is attributed in large measure to the fact that people were tired of the crassness and the incivility and the anger, and are looking for something else. I mean, Joe Biden is running a campaign saying, it's about the soul of America. It's about bringing us back together. I'm going to be the president for the people who voted against me as much as those who voted for me. If the electorate validates those values, I think we may begin to move away from this. If, among other things, if politicians begin to see that there is a price to be paid for incivility at the ballot box, then that's going to be the surest way to begin to move back to a more civil place.
So I want to touch on returning a little bit to the notion of, is civility always a good thing? I have two students, Jamarcus and Olivia, both have asked some questions that I'd love your thoughts on. So Jamarcus asked if there's a way to legitimately speak truth to power, even though it's going to make people uncomfortable in a way that is civil. And Olivia adds, how can marginalized groups remain civil while still making meaningful steps towards change when they've tried to be civil for so many years and have ultimately been ignored? So I think those two questions are sort of speaking to that point of, I think people have been trying to be civil for so long, and yet they're not seeing any movement or change. So what would recommendations do you have for those students?
I would go back to the comment I made earlier, which is, I said Martin Luther King, but, I could have said Gandhi. I could have named any number of people who have shown that you can, some of the people who have brought about the greatest social change and advancement, in world history have gone about it in a civil way. And you could argue that it takes longer, and I'm not saying taking longer is an acceptable thing, but there's a trade-off. And if you want to be nonviolent and you want to be civil, it may take longer to persuade people of the need for progress and change. But I would say that's a necessary trade-off if the alternatives are a further breakdown in civil society and resort eventually to violence.
Greg, you're talking about persuasion and trade-offs and really the art of politics.
Mhm.
Sometimes people are disgusted. Most of the time, most people are disgusted with politics. But trying to understand the current moment, I like to go back to history, and I've made a study recently, a couple of books, of Lincoln in post-election, after his first election, and then preparation for his second inaugural and really the last days of his life. And those two books reminded me of what a politician he was. Frederick Douglass was down on Lincoln as a force for change, but Lincoln was a politician. He was biding time, collecting chits, building momentum, looking for moments. I mean, those are political skills. And Douglass came around. By the time of Lincoln's second inauguration, he understood that Lincoln was the great transformer, the emancipator, and that while he would have done things differently, Lincoln probably had it right. And Lincoln didn't do it all immediately, and Lincoln didn't confess his full hopes initially. He brought people along. And it just had me wonder, and as this recovering Republican, in this moment, could a guy who I've always thought was an incredibly decent person and a patriot, Joe Biden, but a kind of lousy politician, could he actually be, and by politician, I mean messenger, and sometimes I've disagreed ardently with his positions on issues, but could this be the moment? Could his desire for comity and bringing people together at this moment in time, as outdated as it might seem, be exactly the right man in the right moment? Again, I come across as an optimist, I guess I am, but I really hope something like that could happen.
So, mindful of our time, I want to make sure I get a couple more questions in if I can. And the first, I guess, is from Kendall Phillips. Why do you think the American people have become so tolerant of incivility in politics?
Right. Well, I think that's because that's what they get fed nonstop every day. They see cable television, they see people kind of involved in these pugilistic exercises where you combat each other on the airwaves, and they begin to think that that's like what Greg was saying earlier, that that's the norm, that that's the way politics really is supposed to happen. And what they don't get are examples of people who actually are working together quietly, doing the real work of government. I've berated network executives from time to time, like, why don't you go, for all that you cover, why don't you cover a markup session in the US Senate where the people are actually doing real work? They're actually, trying to compromise, trying to find out ways to get real things done. And we just don't get those kinds of examples of what is really uplifting in our politics and the way in which the media covers it. I always love to bash the press. I was the pinata for the press corps at the White House. So I like to bash them back now. But I think that's part of the failure, is that we're not getting the kind of coverage that shows us examples of how real government works and how real people do the work that we need to do to transform the country.
So there's a debate tonight. Carson asks, what advice would you give these candidates going into this debate, not just to be effective and perhaps, move the needle on the election, but to be more civil and to make movements towards civility in our political discourse? I mean, some of it.
Well, find someone other than Donald Trump to be on the stage.
Well, Well, Mike, I mean, you work.
That's not fair. That's not fair. That's not a civil comment. But you
What
know,
Oh, no, it's unfair though. I think, it's a statement of fact. Donald Trump is not constitutionally capable of changing who he is and what he is. I'm sorry. I've given up on that prospect, Mike.
I would advise the former vice president, to not take the bait, and to be true to who he is. And he knows, he can anticipate a number of questions based on the current news cycle, headlines, the article in the New York Post and other things, where he's going to have to brace himself and not take the bait when that happens. It's like preparing for a good interview with a newspaper reporter. Regardless of what question is asked, know the 3 points you want to make. Stick to your points. Pivot and parry. And remember that the goal is to strike a responsive chord with the undecided voter. Separate why your plan and program is better for them, will make their life better, help them feed their family, send their kids to school. I'm being a complete Pollyanna now, because frankly, so many Americans have already voted in this election. They have already made up their mind. I would imagine tonight will be another episode of, potential food fight with mics being cut off. So I hope better, I aspire better for the country, because the country suffers. And in the eyes of the world, I have never seen our reputation in such tatters, and that troubles me greatly.
Jeannie, I assume when you say it's like a interview with a reporter, you were thinking of Leslie Stahl? Maybe?
Exactly.
Well, I would say about the debate, and it reinforce something I said a little bit earlier, but if you were talking to either one of these candidates, all you need to do is say, we have a single data point, because the second debate got canceled. So you want to know how civility and incivility plays out politically in this environment. Look at the first debate. And even Trump, he will never admit it, but I think even Trump would say, he hurt himself through incivility. It's all those, so-called suburban housewives, suburban women voters who you see interviewed all the time now saying, I like his programs, I like what he did on the economy, but I can't stand his manner, his tone, his tweets and all that. And that's why I'm hopeful that if people come to believe that you can pay a very high political price for incivility once you've crossed a certain line, then I think there's some hope for better times. But I would say for preparing either one of them for the debate tonight, and I know we read that President Trump's people have been telling him this, which is you got to tone it down. You're paying a big price for being the way you are.
I want to ask one more question, because as you can see from the chat, we have one of the things that's impressed me with this new generation of students particularly is that they are very engaged. They have a high level of political interest. They're reading a lot, they're super informed, they're paying attention when I think some people of my generation just sort of want to turn away sometimes from the news and the reports of the day. What advice, and maybe if we could get one or two words from each of you, since I know we're coming up on our end, what advice do you have for students who want to work in politics or public service, and how can they create a more civilized tone? What do you recommend to them?
Do it. I'll jump in. Preparing for this conversation with you all today, I thought of Edward R. Murrow and a speech that he gave to the radio and television news directors in 1958, when television was this fancy new technology. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to read an excerpt from it and give you food for thought. He said, and this is a very famous speech, and I encourage you to look up and read this speech. This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and even it can inspire, but it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it's nothing but wires and lights in a box. There is a great and perhaps decisive battle to be fought against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. This weapon of television could be useful. I submit to you, substitute social media for television. And all of you incredibly talented students at the College of Charleston who have enormously bright futures, use your powers for good and put those tools to work on behalf of the nation.
My advice would be, if you want to make a contribution to greater civility in politics, find candidates who behave civilly and help them get elected, help them stay elected. You're not going to convert the person who, for whatever reason, ignores the norms, doesn't care, will do whatever they think it takes to win. But so don't try to, it's like advice that people give those who are about to get married or choose a lifetime mate. Don't think you're going to find somebody and change them. I don't think you're going to go to work for a candidate who's not civil and make that candidate civil. Work for the good people. They're out there, and use your talents to help them be successful.
Greg, I agree completely. I would just say, even do it on campaigns. If you have an interest in politics, find that candidate Greg was talking about and go to work for him. Go help him win a primary. Get in the trenches. Maybe you won't do it but once in your life. Maybe you'll turn it into a career like a number of us have. Either way, get involved.
And let me double up on that and say, here's how you do it. Like, well, how do I go do that? You don't apply for a job, because campaigns are notoriously slow in trying to hire staff, and they do a runaround on that. Just go in, walk in, make yourself indispensable, volunteer. So you might have, you have to give up some time to do that, but just go in and volunteer and show them what you can do. And believe me, after a month or so, they'll say, wow, this person's pretty good. We actually ought to hire them for a job. And, then off you go. And that was literally my experience. I just showed up as a volunteer in the first campaign that I worked in. And, before too long, I got hired and got a job. So, don't think that this is all about something that I have to put on the resume. It's about being engaged and being involved.
Interns run Washington, D.C. It's a little secret.
We are at our time, unfortunately. I think we could talk for hours. There's so many great questions, and you all have offered so many good insights. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an informative discussion. We welcome your engagement with the Bully Pulpit Series.
Beth, can I know I've been watching, we've got a lot of good questions. If you put them together and sent, a little summary of some of the questions that you got around to us, I'd be more than willing to kind of zap back a little email response to some of them, if that would be helpful.
And you can be my spokesman. I agree with everything he said today.
As we're closing up, I just want to remind everyone who is eligible, please make sure you engage in the most important responsibility you have for our democracy, and that is to vote, vote, vote. Get out there and volunteer, get out there and vote. Thank you all to our panelists. Thanks for all of you to coming. We really appreciate your participation, and these are awesome questions. We will do just what Mike suggested and circulate them and get some responses back out. Thanks, everybody.